Are birds secretly evil? Okay, that's a pretty loaded and perhaps strange question, but after diving into hundreds of movies and games, I can't help but notice birds always seem to kind of look evil or imply something evil is about to happen. And I'm not just imagining that because I have ornithophobia or because a seagull stole my ice cream when I was a kid. It's just that I've recently found myself diving headfirst into this obsession with how birds are portrayed in media. And the deeper I dig, the more I start to wonder, why do we seem to keep making them evil? To find the answer, I've explored everything from biology and behavior to how birds are portrayed in folklore and even the most obscure movies. So what is it about the avian archetype that keeps them circling the pages of our stories? And perhaps more importantly, do they actually deserve the reputation we've given them? The thing is, birds aren't just villains. Rather, they tend to present themselves as a question. What do they see from up there that we don't? How do their journeys hide secrets we'll never know? And who ate all my food when I looked away? Perhaps even more than a question, birds are a statement, like a quiet declaration that something is about to unfold. Because I don't need to see a raven landing on a tombstone to sense that something bad is about to happen, but it does make it feel more ominous. So what is it about birds that makes them this perfect vessel for fear and mystery? Why do we look at a raven and think, messenger of death, but we see a golden retriever and we think, good boy? Which brings me to my next point, because there is a pretty big inconsistency here. Obviously, not all birds are portrayed as evil. For every omen-bearing raven, there's a wise owl. And it's this divide that suggests that birds are not simply assigned meaning based on their nature, but are instead shaped by cultural perception, storytelling traditions, and human projection. Maybe that's why we often attribute ulterior motives to them or have this image that they're always scheming. It's really no wonder humanity has spent centuries trying to fly, perhaps hoping to understand the perspective of the quiet onlookers. In every bird I observe, this duality appears to be present, a perfect mix of calm observation and subtle villainy. And it's this combination that makes them such compelling figures in storytelling as creatures that feel both grounded in nature and impossibly mysterious at the same time. Which brings me to one of the best portrayals of an antagonistic avian and also one of my favorite villains of all time. Wallace and Gromit, The Wrong Trousers, and A Vengeance Most Foul are a masterclass of pure malice with a plasticine penguin.
Part of what makes him so amazing as a character is the fact that he's a penguin. He's a master criminal. He's disguised himself as a chicken with a rubber glove.
We've all unknowingly been paying the price ever since creator Nick Park seemingly declared, "I will show you fear in the form of a penguin-shaped lump of clay." In the movies, Wallace is the quintessential cheerful inventor, creating whimsical tools like a mechanized garden gnome to make gardening easier. Feathers McGraw, on the other hand, is the perfect counterbalance, an agent of corruption who turns those innocent inventions into tools of chaos. However, what really elevates Feathers isn't just his schemes, but his complete lack of expression. Part of what makes Wallace and Gromit so iconic is how absurdly expressive every character is. Their lips could practically qualify as independent characters, and Gromit, who basically only has his eyebrows, still manages to convey more personality than two average humans combined. Then there's Feathers, who is the exact opposite. He has a face, but it's not really for using. No sclera, no shifting expressions. It's just a lump of clay given form with the purpose of being expressionless and only the minimum necessary to tell you, this is a penguin. I'd say he's like a robot wearing the skin of an animal, but that's literally the bad guy from A Close Shave, who, unlike Feathers, couldn't help but wear his villainy on his face. Well, his dog robot face. And yet that's what makes him so uniquely menacing and funny. He doesn't need to emote because his sheer blankness does all the heavy lifting. So as it turns out, it's not just the beady eyes or the subtle air of scheming that makes birds so villainous.
You are by far the most evil thing I've encountered. Offer your soul to me, Dark One.
It's the way their very appearance provides the perfect blank canvas for our imagination to project onto. With their sharp angles and inscrutable stares, they're practically designed to embody menace. But here's the thing, and this is important. On a scale of humanity, birds probably aren't actually evil. But on a scale of avians, there is a solid case to be made for their cunning. Let's start with a species like the magpies that embody some traits that we would often associate with human-like villains, such as their habit of pilfering and their relentless attacks because apparently you stumbled into the wrong neighborhood. Then there are the shrikes that impale their prey on thorns or barbed wire to store food and tear it apart later, earning them the nickname butcher birds for their gruesome yet efficient hunting strategy. And cuckoos lay eggs in nests of other bird species, so they raise them as their own. And when they hatch, the cuckoo chicks kick the other eggs out of the nest. Okay, that one, it's pretty evil. But that's because we interpret actions like manipulation and opportunism through our own moral lens. Animals exhibit this kind of behavior purely for survival. It's just driven by instinct and evolution. Cuckoos and shrikes may seem evil, but their behavior is kind of just nature's way of ensuring their species can thrive. From a storytelling perspective, animals offer a shorthand to define a character's archetype without the need for a lengthy exposition. A fox is clever, a lion is noble, and a vulture probably doesn't need a full story arc to understand why it's on the board of directors to manage finances. But perhaps it's this showmanship that makes birds so irresistible as storytelling devices. They're not just surviving, but thriving in a way that feels calculated. A fox sneaking into a henhouse feels pretty natural, but a raven perched ominously in a tree will always feel like it's up to no good. These expectations and this blend of myth and reality bring us to the main problem. The way we see birds in stories obviously doesn't always line up with how they behave in real life. But then again, that's kind of the point. Fiction thrives on exaggeration, and birds provide this surprisingly wide palette to paint on. Owls, for example, are often used as symbols of wisdom and serve as guides to heroes in their most important moments, like Hedwig delivering important letters and packages and Archimedes giving out unwanted and frankly hurtful advice.
If man were meant to fly, he'd have been born with wings.
Okay, you don't have to rub it in. But weirdly enough, the owl's actual existence couldn't be further from the archetype we've constructed. In nature, owls are solitary hunters, masters of ambush with incredible precision to hunt down prey, with a talent for silent flight that culminates in neck-breaking efficiency. It paints them as creatures of pragmatism and not necessarily wisdom. Their piercing gaze is often romanticized as insightful or knowing, but in truth, it's a predatory adaptation that is optimized for survival in the dark. Still, I would argue that it is this disconnect that makes the owl such a captivating figure in fables. We impose wisdom onto their inscrutable stare and mysticism onto their nocturnal nature, to craft it into an archetype that reflects our own desire for guidance. So where did this whole divide in bird portrayals actually begin? Well, to answer that question, we need to circle all the way back to their deep roots in folklore and mythology, because looking back, it seems that birds have occupied a liminal space in human imagination for as long as we can remember. Somehow, even in ancient history, flying creatures seem to get stuck between divine symbols that will lift up a wedding dress and dive bombers that will attack just because they hate your new haircut. To go back to owls one more time, they became the emblems of knowledge that we see them as in Greek mythology, which is probably why Athena, the goddess of wisdom, is rarely depicted without her little owl, a creature that doesn't just accompany her, but reflects the intellect and insights she represents. On the other hand, it seems that once again this duality in how we view owls existed even in ancient history, because in Roman mythology, they were seen as omens of misfortune and death. The story goes that by placing an owl feather near someone sleeping could apparently make them reveal their darkest secrets, which honestly sounds less like ancient folklore and more like the original form of late-night drunk texting. If there's one type of bird that feels like a walking or flying spoiler for bad things to come, it has to be ravens and crows. With their inky black plumage and centuries-old ties to death and prophecy, they've become the ultimate shorthand for approaching death.
They want grim and gritty, huh? Happy to play the part.
I mean, it does track. They're dark, they sound ominous, and they'll eat pretty much anything they stumble across, including, you know, battlefield leftovers or corpses hanging from the gallows. It's no wonder they've become the go-to scary birds in mythology and pop culture, as they are practically synonymous with bad vibes. And just in case it still wasn't obvious enough, someone decided to really hammer it home. Because a group of crows is called a murder, and a group of ravens is an unkindness or conspiracy. It's so on the nose, it's like they were put on this earth specifically so writers and poets could use them in their tales. So perhaps on a more philosophical level, birds like this tap into our desire to connect with something bigger than ourselves. They can fly where we can't, see things we never will, and move through the world with a kind of effortlessness that's just out of reach for us. It's all too easy to project meaning onto birds because they exist in this magical in-between space, above the earth but not entirely removed from it. Okay, now that we've delved into birds' mystical qualities and their role as messengers of something greater, let's trade our wings for walking shoes and get back to reality. Because if we're being honest, birds aren't just ethereal symbols. They're also forces of pure, unfiltered chaos. Because beneath the serene feathers lies a streak of unhinged mischief that nature seems to have baked right in. We recognize this chaotic bird energy in the way they exist outside our rules, untethered and indifferent to the norms we live by. And it's this unpredictability that feels like rebellion, even if it's just nature being, well, nature. It's a hard truth to accept, especially for me, but a seagull probably doesn't steal ice cream out of malice, even if it definitely feels personal. So, of course, in a video about birds, we can't skip over the most famous bird movie of all time. Alfred Hitchcock's 1963 masterpiece, The Birds, takes the idea of sky dwellers soaring high above us as symbols of freedom and yanks them right down to earth in the most horrifying way possible. What makes The Birds so fascinating, aside from the surprisingly great special effects for a 1963 movie, is how it strips away the archetype of birds as messengers or omens and places them in constant proximity to humans. More than just a horror film, Hitchcock reveals that the feathered antagonists rise up against humanity to punish them for taking nature for granted, showing that it's dangerous to impose too much meaning or too much control on animals. Birds, like all creatures, aren't here to fit neatly into our narratives. They are forces of nature that deserve respect rather than domination. Because what could we realistically do if birds one day decided they've had enough of us?
That's a sparrow, all right. We know what it is, Al.
Like, what's the plan here? Are we just going to put all the birds in prison? And maybe it's the early portrayals of birds that came shortly after Hitchcock's movie that further developed them into some of my favorite characters. Not because they reinvented birds entirely, but because Zazu from The Lion King and Iago from Aladdin were used in unexpected roles that helped develop modern storytelling. Birds in this era weren't just background decoration, but became characters with depth, personality, and in the case of the most famous duck on the planet, a fiery and chaotic temperament. So take 2003 Finding Nemo seagulls, for example.
Mine.
They're not exactly bird geniuses, but they're also not the embodiment of bird stereotypes. This scene is probably the perfect representation of birds' shameless opportunism. In gaming, Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker, and later Breath of the Wild gave us the Rito as a race of bird-like humanoids who have evolved from the aquatic Zora folk, and they are not so subtly inspired by avian grace in this game. Their ability to take to the skies in a game where you're otherwise confined to sailing a vast open sea felt like the ultimate expression of contrast and possibility. The Rito represent a kind of liberation, a break from the limiting water-bound exploration to offer glimpses of what lay above and beyond. The Rito show us the untouchable, almost mocking freedom that comes with flight. So, if Alfred Hitchcock made the most famous movie about birds, Rovio Entertainment made the most famous game about birds. Clearly, elegance and strategy aren't exactly the priority in Angry Birds. It's just catapult-launched birds on a mission to destroy everything in their path to reclaim their stolen eggs. The only thing that really matters is how fast, how far, and how much destruction you can cause in a single moment. It's not chess. It's not even checkers. It's just flinging birds into stuff because it looks funny. I'm not about to sit here and dissect the deeper meaning of a game where birds willingly launch themselves into pigs in structurally unsound towers, but there's something about it that just wouldn't work with any other animal. If you want something that bridges the chaotic energy of Angry Birds with a more grounded look at nature, the game A Short Hike made me reevaluate the position of birds within an ecosystem, because sometimes they're just living, existing and soaring through open skies without a care in the world. This is one of those games I didn't expect to enjoy because it just seemed too small to leave much of an impression. But with its short runtime and the glowing reviews it kept racking up, I figured, why not give it a shot? And it honestly didn't even take 15 minutes for me to realize I was playing something special. Because more than just a short, relaxing exploration game, A Short Hike feels like a gentle look at what life might be like for birds. Not in their chaotic ice cream stealing moments, but in the quieter ones. Because there's a strange kind of freedom that comes with gliding through the air in the same effortless way a bird does. Everywhere you go in this world, it feels like it was built just to be able to experience it in the way someone with wings would. The goal of the game is to reach the summit of Hawk Peak to get cell reception. However, it's the way you move through the world by soaring over treetops and diving into water that makes the journey more memorable than the destination itself. There is no grand quest for survival or dominance. You're just flying around doing things that a bird would probably be doing, like fishing and playing beach stickball. Okay, this game is awesome. I've been missing out. A Short Hike is less of a game and more of a perspective that helps us to let go of our human busyness, even if it is just for a short moment. But there is another well-known game about a bird and the existential horrors of living in a small English town. Untitled Goose Game flips the script entirely, dropping you into the role of a chaotic honking menace terrorizing an unsuspecting English village. Instead of graceful flight or serene exploration, this game is just about being as annoying as possible, proving that birds don't always just coexist with ecosystems and will happily upend them instead. This is why, despite all this grace in flight, their actual behavior on the ground is often completely ridiculous. They're not prey like rabbits, not domesticated like dogs, and they're not predators like wolves. Well, for the most part anyway. So even if you take a step back, beyond the media that they appear in, sometimes they're symbols of peace, sometimes they're omens of death, and sometimes they're just complete jerks. Which actually reminds me of the Emu War of 1932. Yes, you did hear that right. The Emu War was an almost comically tragic attempt by Australian soldiers to control an emu population, wreaking havoc on crops in Western Australia. Armed with machine guns, the military quickly discovered that the flightless birds were surprisingly tactical and would scatter in small groups to evade capture. Although many emu lives were lost, the population persisted and continued to cause crop destruction. I guess the only lesson to learn from this is to never bring a gun to a bird fight. It really just goes to show that in some ways, birds are the gardeners of the natural world, spreading seeds and pollinating plants, but in other ways, they can throw entire ecosystems out of balance when the wrong species ends up in the wrong place. There is always the possibility, of course, that you've been watching this entire video with a raised eyebrow, because obviously,
birds aren't real.
Birds are not real.
I think the evidence is all around us.
For those unfamiliar, the birds aren't real movement is a satirical conspiracy theory that claims all birds were replaced by government surveillance drones in the mid-20th century. The way it works is that birds trace civilians using a liquid tracking device. So that's why it's always on cars. And I guess when I really think about it, I've never actually seen a baby pigeon. Huh. This movement bears an almost uncanny resemblance to how we engage with birds in media and culture, because in this framework they are no longer graceful or chaotic. Instead, they're supposed to be cold, unfeeling machines that serve a hidden agenda, which is exactly how we've seen certain bird villains carry themselves. And it's hard to ignore the irony when you consider platforms like Twitter, which chose a bird icon to represent communication and connection. A bird as a symbol of free expression feels almost too obvious when placed alongside the birds aren't real movement. After all, all, if birds are just surveillance tools, what does that say about our tweets? Which, by the way, in 2021, some supporters of the movement demonstrated in front of Twitter's San Francisco headquarters, demanding that the company change its bird logo. Well, mission accomplished, I guess. So in the end, birds aren't entirely evil, but if we're being honest, I think it's a little funny how we're portraying them as symbols of peace when they spend most of their time screaming at nothing or picking fights with random cyclists. Also, I'm pretty sure seagulls are just criminals. And maybe that's the real problem with how we portray birds. It's not that they're evil or good, but that they're everything at once. Wise and scheming, majestic and mischievous, serene and chaotic. They refuse to fit neatly into any one category, which might be why we keep casting them as both heroes and villains. I don't think birds need our narratives to justify their existence. They were here long before our stories, and they'll be here long after. They're just out there, being birds, soaring high above, sometimes swooping down to steal our ice cream. Okay, that was a little strange, wasn't it? Especially for a channel I made to talk about cosmic horror. But I really enjoy different aspects of world building, and the bird archetype is one that has always fascinated me, so I just felt like I had to make a video on it. We'll go back to the true existential dread very soon, but for now, I just wanted to thank you for being part of this journey, and who knows, maybe we'll do something more lighthearted again in the future. If that sounds good to you, you can help me out by liking, subscribing, and hitting the bell icon to stay up to date. And I'll see you in the next video.